Luke Danner had never imagined he would end up in a planned suburban neighborhood, much less one with private landscaping rules, mailboxes with height limits, and smiling committee members who used the phrase community spirit like a weapon. For most of his adult life, he had stayed on the move, working contract welding jobs across the Midwest, fixing structural iron in freezing winds, patching collapsed support joints for cities that cared more about their budgets than their bridges. His hands were scarred and heavy from decades of fire, pressure, and pressure-tested steel. He hadn't had much time for permanence, let alone for a house with hydrangeas and driveways scrubbed with vinegar. But when he turned 58, something shifted. Maybe it was the noise fatigue. Maybe it was just the way his left knee had begun to grind when he walked, a memory of an old sight fall coming back with cruel consistency. Or maybe it was the funeral of a man he'd worked with for 12 years, dead of an aneurysm before 60, with only a 2-bedroom rental and a rusted-out GMC to show for it. Luke wasn't afraid of dying, not exactly. He was just afraid of disappearing. So, when he saw the listing, a small 2-bedroom home in a gated development an hour outside the city, quiet, orderly, and aggressively neat, he didn't think about whether it was the right cultural fit. He thought about what it would be like to finally have his name on something, to bolt his workbench to a wall that no landlord could object to. So he bought it outright. No mortgage, no strings. One house, one garage, one chance to make something his. From the start, it was clear he didn't belong. Not because of anything he said or did, Luke didn't talk much, but because he existed outside the rhythm of the place. While neighbors unrolled turf and called landscapers, he mowed his own lawn. While others installed artificial garden lights and chrome wind chimes, he built a modest raised bed for peppers and kale, boxed in with untreated cedar. His tools didn't come from online catalogs with decorative fonts. They were battered, sharp-edged, and oil-smeared. The garage, his sanctuary, smelled of hot steel, acetone, and corded plastic. That was his cathedral, and nestled in the back, like a secret kept safe, was an old golf cart he'd restored from a junk lot in Ohio. The frame had once been twisted, the body spray-painted in patches by kids with nothing better to do, but Luke had stripped it down to the bolts and rebuilt it piece by piece. It purred now, not loudly, but with a low, confident hum, the kind of sound that said nothing could surprise it again. He didn't know it yet, but that cart would become more than a side project. It would become the line he refused to cross without fire. The first 6 weeks passed without trouble. A few clipped conversations on the sidewalk, polite but hollow. He nodded to the mailman, waved to the older woman who always watered her azaleas at 7:15 a.m. sharp. The place was methodical, controlled, and dull in a way that should have calmed him. But it didn't. Something about it scratched at his nerves, like grit under fresh paint. It wasn't one thing. It was the way people looked just a little too long when he parked his work truck in the driveway. The way their smiles tightened when they saw his boots. The way they introduced themselves with first names but always followed it with their role on a committee. Then came the first warning slip. Not a conversation, not a knock at the door. Just a glossy piece of cardstock taped to his front door while he was at the hardware store. The word non-compliance in a cheerful, curling script at the top. Apparently, the pepper bed wasn't in the approved aesthetic color palette, and the rain barrel behind the shed, something not even visible from the street, was a potential mosquito breeding site. It ended with a friendly note. Please reach out to your community liaison, Karen Meeks, to resolve this matter amicably. Luke stared at the note for a long time before folding it twice and dropping it in the trash. That was his first mistake. Karen Meeks, it turned out, was the kind of woman who weaponized proximity. She was in her late 50s, round-bodied and always overdressed for the occasion, with tightly permed hair and a voice that carried whether she wanted it to or not. She walked with a kind of practiced superiority, her clipboard angled just so, her eyes scanning like searchlights. Karen didn't knock or call. She waited until Luke was pulling weeds out back and appeared at the gate, her pastel sweater draped like armor over her shoulders. "Mr. Danner," she called, chipper but firm. "I noticed you received your first little reminder. No big deal. Just part of helping everyone stay on the same page. We're all neighbors, after all." Luke didn't answer. He nodded once and turned back to his garden, the sun hot on the back of his neck. The next warning came 2 days later. This time it included a photograph, grainy and zoomed in, showing his dog, Tank, a lazy bulldog mix sitting 6 inches over the boundary line between lawn and sidewalk. "Leash law violation," it read. "Animals must remain fully within property bounds at all times." Luke didn't even own a printer. Someone had taken the picture, printed it, filed it, and submitted it, all for a dog that hadn't moved more than 4 feet in an hour. And then came the patrols. At first, they were subtle, just 2 golf carts with small reflective stickers moving slowly down the streets around dinner time. But within a week, they doubled. Now they moved at random hours, early mornings, past midnight, silently gliding past homes with mounted spotlights and clipboarded volunteers in matching polos. They didn't smile anymore. They watched. When Luke walked Tank in the evening, he'd feel the slow creep of tires behind him, hear the soft radio static from the cart's dash, see Karen herself with a flashlight, eyes narrowed at the hedges as though expecting to find contraband behind the lavender. He tried, for a time, to keep calm. He clipped the hedges. He painted the rain barrel beige. He even relocated the garden bed 2 feet inward. But each concession was followed by another infraction. Grass height 2.75 inches. Unapproved flagpole base. Excessive use of private drive for mechanical activity. And the worst part, each report carried a quiet judgment. A whisper between neighbors. A pause in conversation when he passed. Luke wasn't a man of outbursts. He'd learned long ago that fury was better welded into steel than thrown into walls. But something in this place, it was engineered to suffocate, not with noise but with structure, with rituals designed to erase the parts of you that didn't conform. He started sleeping less, eating less. The tools in his garage began to take new positions. He spent long hours examining schematics, testing fuel dispersal systems, looking into materials resistant to flame and time. He wasn't angry, not yet, but something was building, quiet and molten underneath the shell of routine. They thought they were taming him with paper and politeness. What they didn't know was that Luke Danner didn't get loud when he was cornered. He built. It started, as these things often do, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with something quiet, petty, and calculated. Luke came home one Tuesday evening after picking up welding gas refills from the next county over, a trip that took nearly 2 hours with traffic and construction delays, and found an official-looking envelope wedged into the seam of his front door. It wasn't stamped or mailed. Someone had walked up and pressed it there by hand, careful not to damage the weather seal. Inside was a citation sheet, a formatted letter bearing a committee seal, and a printed fine schedule. 3 violations were listed: unauthorized structural activity, use of garage space for industrial operations, and refusal to cooperate with community engagement policy. The fines totaled $860. No explanation, no pictures, no signatures. Just the weight of paper, thick and self-assured. Luke stood on the porch for a full 5 minutes, staring at the letter in the light of the single bulb above the door, its glow casting hard shadows across the ink. He flipped the page looking for any real justification, but there was none. No dates, no details, just bureaucratic vagueness wrapped in faux professionalism. It was the kind of letter that didn't demand a response. It demanded submission. He walked inside, set the envelope on the kitchen counter, and didn't touch it again for 3 days. The next time he saw Karen Meeks, she was seated in the passenger side of one of the community patrol carts, her hair rigid with hairspray, her sunglasses oversized and opaque, She didn't look at him directly as they passed his driveway. She just lifted a hand, 2 fingers, not quite a wave, and made a note on her clipboard. The driver, a younger man in a green polo with the committee's stitched crest, slowed just slightly as they approached his mailbox, then sped back up when Luke stepped outside. Luke didn't speak. He didn't move quickly. He simply opened the mailbox, checked the inside, and turned back without a word. He wasn't playing their game. Not yet, but it escalated. Someone, Luke never saw who, began scraping his curb with a hard metal object. The concrete wore down in tiny, deliberate gouges, as if someone were trying to make his property look unkempt. His mailbox door was found unlatched on several mornings, though he knew he'd closed it. The motion sensor light he'd installed over the garage was unscrewed in the night, dangling uselessly by one exposed wire. The most unsettling part was how none of it was openly destructive. It was all surgical, measured, the sort of sabotage designed to be dismissed as paranoia if mentioned aloud. When he called the non-emergency line to report what he politely called targeted neighborhood interference, the deputy on the other end responded with a question that made his stomach clench. "Are you the guy with the cart?" The cart. Not a name. Not an address. Just that. The implication was clear. Luke was already a category, a subject of discussion. He asked the deputy if there had been other complaints, and the man exhaled into the receiver. "It's a community issue," he said, and that was the end of the call. That night, Luke drove to a diner 20 minutes out of town and sat at the counter for 2 hours, drinking coffee he didn't want, staring at a wall he didn't see, replaying the last 2 months in his head. It wasn't that he didn't understand what was happening. It was that he did. He knew this kind of thing. Not from books or television, but from job sites and small towns where the boss's nephew got every permit approved while others were cited for imaginary violations. This wasn't about rules. This was about message discipline, about power through paperwork, intimidation through neighborly smiles. And now they were trying to tighten the noose without leaving bruises. He didn't shout. He didn't rant. He wrote. The next day, he compiled a detailed letter to the County Housing Division, outlining the citations, the lack of due process, the coordinated surveillance, and the physical interference with his property. He attached photos, dates, and times. He was careful with his language, precise with his tone. He wasn't asking for help. He was documenting a record. The packet went into certified mail. He kept the receipt. He made copies. 3 days later, a second letter arrived, this one marked Mandatory Action Required. It was a summons to a disciplinary hearing hosted by the committee citing failure to engage with corrective processes. The meeting would take place the 28 following Tuesday behind closed doors and would determine his status as a community participant. No outside representation was allowed. He laughed when he read that. Not because it was funny, but because of how predictable it was. They weren't even pretending to play fair. Still, he responded. He drafted a notarized letter declining to attend, citing pending documentation review by the county. He sent a copy to the committee office, another to the registered management agent, and a third to the lawyer who had helped him settle his uncle's estate 10 years earlier. He wasn't going to handle this alone. That wasn't strength. That was ego. And Luke had long since learned to set his ego aside when strategy mattered more. Then came the dog incident. One morning, he opened the back door to find Tank limping. A small smear of red marked the tile. His front left paw was cut. Clean, shallow, but deliberate. Not a puncture from a thorn, not a tear from a fence. Luke carried him inside, washed the wound, and sat with him for hours, watching his breathing. That night, he rewired the motion sensor and tied it into a backup power source. He installed 3 new trail cameras, one on the fence, one in the tree near the alley, and one disguised as a fake bird feeder near the driveway. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't call the committee. He didn't even leave the house the next day. He waited, and he saw them. At 3:27 a.m., A grainy figure moved across the side gate, a woman, short, wearing light-colored sneakers and a windbreaker. She held a flashlight in one hand, a phone in the other. She didn't touch anything. She didn't stay long. But she stood near the workbench behind the garage for almost 5 full minutes, taking photos. And just before she left, she scribbled something on a notepad. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but it was enough. Luke stored it twice, once in the cloud, once on an encrypted flash drive. He brought the drive to the county office the following morning and requested a meeting with the property enforcement liaison. It took 3 hours and 4 transfers, but he got 15 minutes with someone who finally listened. The woman watched the footage, asked 2 questions, then nodded. "This is outside their purview," she said. "We'll escalate." It was the first time Luke felt like he had ground under his feet, but it also triggered a response. By the end of that week, a massive laminated notice was duct-taped to his garage. "This property is under review for non-conformity to community safety regulations." 2 days after that, a fire marshal arrived, unannounced, unscheduled, and stone-faced. He cited Luke for improper storage of flammable materials. Luke showed him the cabinets, labeled, grounded within code. The marshal shrugged and wrote him up anyway. He said it would be handled upstairs. Luke didn't react. He simply filed the paper away, added it to the growing folder in his desk drawer, and made one last modification to the cart. A heat deflection shield across the top. Just a strip of aluminum, reinforced and fixed at an angle. Then he waited, not for a chance to blow up, but for the moment to deliver his message. Not in rage, in structure, in fire, in form, and in absolute control. The escalation didn't arrive as a blowout or a dramatic confrontation. It unfolded like a quiet administrative campaign, systemic, faceless, nearly invisible. After Luke filed his formal complaint with the county property office and submitted evidence of nighttime trespassing, things began to shift. Not overtly, but structurally. The small privileges of residency started to dissolve. The local newsletter stopped arriving. His address no longer triggered account access in the resident's web portal. When neighbors searched the app to message him, his name no longer populated. Officially, he was still there. Legally, he owned the property, but functionally, he was being rewritten, his presence blotted out not with confrontation, but with silence. The garbage pickup stopped next. The bins were emptied one week, then vanished entirely the next. When Luke called the waste service, they told him his collection had been canceled by request. But he hadn't submitted any request. The cancellation had come through the system, logged with a valid property ID, but under a different email and contact number. He tried to trace it. He hit a wall. The supervisor, when pressed, admitted it wasn't the first time something like this had happened in that neighborhood. That was the point when he stopped treating it like a string of coincidences. He began keeping a hard-copy journal of every interaction, every time a patrol cart passed, every time he found a new printed notice attached to his front door, every conversation that took a strange turn. He took screenshots. He made physical backups. He encrypted camera footage and stored it off-site. No more assumptions. No more trust in resolution through dialogue. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. But then came the citations. Not fines, not complaints. Citations, official, formal, delivered by courier in a sealed envelope with a contact number that routed to an answering service. They accused him of improper use of his garage, of harboring flammable materials, of generating industrial-level mechanical noise. The fines weren't just financial, they came with conditions. Required remedial engagement, probationary review. Status: potential eligibility revocation. It sounded bureaucratic, but he understood the subtext. Your right to live here is no longer guaranteed. He responded by requesting documentation of the code they cited. In return, he received an automated letter stating the material was under internal review and not available to individual residents. He called the property office. They told him they had no authority over internal compliance policy. He called the fire marshal's office. They referred him back to the development committee. The circle closed. The silence tightened. Then they escalated physically. He returned home one afternoon to find a fluorescent sign zip-tied to his front gate, marked in bold red. This property is currently under review for non-conforming safety infrastructure. No explanation. Just that. A threat without detail. A label without recourse. When he peeled it off and called the number printed in the corner, he got an automated message directing him to submit further inquiry via secure online form. The form didn't exist. That night, something sharp was scattered at the base of his rear gate. His dog, Tank, limped inside with a cut paw. The wound wasn't deep, but it was clean, sliced in a way that didn't come from branches or pavement. Luke said nothing. He cleaned the wound, watched over the animal, and added another entry to his log. He didn't call animal control. He didn't post online. He installed new trail cameras instead, motion-triggered, infrared-enabled, wired directly to a backup system in his garage. Days passed. Then one evening, he found 3 uniformed patrol volunteers standing outside his property, one with a clipboard, one with a body cam, the third holding what looked like a portable scanner. They didn't approach. They stood behind the curb, pointing at his garage, gesturing at the cart parked inside. He watched from the kitchen window. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They recorded. Then they left. The following week, a letter arrived. Mandatory hearing, private, not open to counsel. The subject line was determination of participant standing. No legal body, no court, just a committee of peers making decisions behind a locked door. He didn't attend. Instead, he filed an affidavit with the county clerk stating his refusal to engage in extrajudicial disciplinary processes that lacked statutory authority. He attached documentation, filed notarized copies, and CC'd an attorney with experience in property disputes. He didn't threaten litigation. He prepared for it. Then came the false reports, fire code violations, improper vehicle storage, unverified chemical odors. Each one prompted a knock, a visit, or an inspection, none of which ever resulted in action. But the record remained, and the record was the point. It wasn't about guilt. It was about building a pattern. Make the target look unstable long enough, and it becomes real in the eyes of the system. Luke didn't retaliate. He reinforced. The cart, once a project for leisure, became a point of principle. He added plating along the flanks. Not armor, but reinforcement. He bolted a sound baffle along the rear axle. He adjusted the power source to distribute weight more evenly. He made it road legal under the state's limited motorized vehicle classification and filed it under his name with a secondary tag. He applied for a fire effects permit, one used by theater companies and holiday festivals, to authorize the use of a visible heat plume under controlled conditions. The ethanol system he installed was safe, compliant, and entirely above board. He wasn't building a weapon. He was building a symbol. And then, finally, the social fracture completed itself. Where before there had been uneasy politeness, now there was a pure exclusion. Conversation stopped when he approached. Sidewalks cleared. The neighbor across the street, who once nodded on morning walks, no longer met his eyes. One woman he had helped jumpstart her car refused to accept a package he signed for while she was out. No one argued. They simply removed him from the landscape. And through all of it, Karen Meeks was present, not directly, not openly, but visible. At every meeting, every announcement, always close enough to see, never close enough to confront. Her name didn't appear on the letters. Her signature wasn't on the violations, but her shadow was all over them. Luke understood now that the system didn't require truth to operate. It only required consistency, a quiet rhythm of paperwork and accusation. If done slowly enough, even honest people would begin to believe there must be some reason behind it all. That maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't the system. Maybe it was him. But Luke had done his accounting. He knew where the problem lived, and he wasn't going anywhere. He didn't need to win the argument. He just needed them to hear the engine. Luke knew that silence wasn't the same as surrender. After weeks of passive pressure, false citations, and neighborly disapproval packaged as concern, the rhythm of harassment slowed, but not from fatigue. It was a tactical pause, a breath before another push. He had seen it before, on work sites where management softened before striking hard, in towns where enforcement checked in before writing you out. It always looked like mercy, but it was reconnaissance. So, when the knock finally came, not on the front door, but on his mailbox, a small blue sticker pressed into the upper corner with the words, "Pre-review site visit scheduled," he didn't flinch. He circled it in red marker, took a photo, peeled it off, and stored it with the others. The sticker didn't say who scheduled the visit or why. No logo, no agency. But Luke didn't need to be told. It wasn't the state. It was the people behind the people, the internal faction that now considered itself legitimate governance. He spent that weekend going over every inch of his property, not hiding evidence, not removing anything, just documenting. He took pictures, logged timestamps, remeasured distances, and noted every element that could be interpreted. His welding tanks were capped, chained, and labeled. His fire-rated cabinet had no corrosion, no leaks. His cart was parked, powered down, and positioned legally. He updated his paperwork, added new notations, and sent a summary package to the county records office. Not because he thought they would do anything, but because he was building a case for himself, not a plea for rescue. Then he waited. The visit came without warning, as expected. 3 individuals, unbadged, arrived in an unmarked vehicle that parked diagonally across the edge of his driveway. They didn't knock. They took photographs. They walked the sidewalk in a pattern that mimicked utility inspection but didn't match any real survey practice. Luke watched from the side window, arms crossed, not hiding, not inviting. One of them, a tall man with dark glasses and no name tag, pointed toward the cart. The woman next to him, hair in a severe bun, nodded and jotted something down. Within 15 minutes they left. No interaction, no paperwork, no statement of findings. Just presence, data collection, and departure. That night, Luke sat in his garage with the main light off, working under a standing lamp, the warm hum of the bulb cutting a narrow cone across the hood of the cart. He wasn't afraid. He was calculating. This wasn't about being right. It wasn't about justice. It was about resilience. The kind that didn't require speeches or slogans, just the ability to remain unmoved while someone tried to erase your existence from the inside out. He wasn't trying to prove anything to them anymore. He was preparing for the moment when his existence would no longer be questioned but declared, in a way that couldn't be ignored. The idea came not in anger, but in precision. If they wanted to surveil, then he would provide something worth watching. Not violence. Not spectacle for its own sake. Something exact. A demonstration. Not of power, but of presence. He reviewed the specifications again, checked the fire plume regulators, cleaned the ethanol tanks, and pressure-tested the delivery lines. The system was sound. He ran heat simulations in the driveway using a fire-retardant tarp and boundary flags. Each time the plumes deployed, the air shimmered but didn't burn. The effect was theatrical, legal, and completely within local fire safety code. It wasn't a threat, it was a performance. One engineered by compliance, protected by certification, and immune to subjective complaint. Still, Luke knew this wasn't enough. The message had to be received by the right audience at the right time. A scattered act would be misinterpreted. A personal statement ignored. But a controlled entry, under conditions that were already public, within the space of their own authority? That would be undeniable. He waited for the perfect opportunity. The annual Community Update Forum. Not a real civic event, not government-sanctioned, but held in the community pavilion, chaired by the same voices behind the silent campaign against him. Open to residents, publicly announced, scheduled, structured. The ideal moment. He prepared calmly, printed all documentation, laminated it, bound it, marked every page with color-coded tabs. He wasn't coming to argue. He was coming to deliver. The night before the forum, he walked the perimeter of his garage one last time, checking every anchor point, testing every tool. Not a weapon, a device, not a vehicle, a platform. The final touch was a modified speaker housing beneath the cart's center frame. It would not broadcast slogans or music. It would emit a low-frequency pulse, barely audible but enough to register as atmosphere. Not enough to shake anything, enough to create weight. He didn't sleep much, not out of anxiety, out of focus. The morning came with overcast skies and thick air. He dressed plainly, heavy boots, fire-resistant shirt, neutral colors, no theatrics, just presence. As he guided the cart from the garage, the modified engine hummed with clean energy. Silent, efficient, fully electric, emission-free. Legal in every detail. Visible in every angle. Unmistakable in intent. When he rolled down the street, nobody blocked his path. But nobody waved either. Lawn chairs shifted. Children were pulled closer to legs. Phones rose, not with hostility, but with confusion. The cart wasn't aggressive. It moved slowly, carefully. But its presence demanded acknowledgement. By the time he arrived at the pavilion, the chairs were mostly full, the committee seated in matching polos and jackets, Karen Meeks dead center, her sunglasses perched like armor, hands folded in her lap like a queen presiding over a stable realm. Luke parked at the rear edge of the gathering, away from the path, off the central line. He stepped out unhurried, opened the rear compartment of the cart and removed a single binder. Laminated. Tabbed. He walked across the grass without a word, stepped directly to the edge of the table, and placed the binder in front of the chair next to Karen's. She didn't look at him. Her expression didn't shift. But her jaw locked for a fraction of a second. Luke nodded, turned back, and returned to the cart. Then, only then, he activated the system. The ignition flared with a low hum. The regulated ethanol system hissed once, primed, and a controlled column of fire burst upward in a clean line, followed by another, then another. 12 in total, each rising 10 feet, synchronized in rhythm. The heat was real, but the flames were controlled. They left no scorch, no trail, just presence. The roar echoed once, briefly, and then silence reclaimed the space. No alarms, no injuries, no damage. He turned off the engine. No speech. No explanation. He stepped back out, handed a second binder to a man filming near the tables, then got back into the cart and drove away. Not fast, not slow. Just enough to leave space behind him where there had been none. No one moved. And that was the point. They didn't respond immediately. For the first 48 hours after Luke's controlled fire demonstration at the community forum, there was only silence. No letters, no citations, no visits, not even a passive-aggressive flyer tucked under his door handle. The quiet felt unnatural, like the pause before a break in a storm. Luke didn't trust it. He didn't believe in luck or hesitation. He believed in cycles, in patterns, and this one was all too familiar. The absence of response wasn't restraint. It was recalibration. They were figuring out how to come back at him in a way that couldn't be dismissed as retaliation. He had shown them up in public, and more importantly, he had done it without breaking a single rule. That kind of precision stung deeper than defiance. It made them look powerless in their own house. On the third day, the escalation began. not with a fine or a citation, but with noise. Real, weaponized noise. Early in the morning, before the sun broke the horizon, Luke was woken by an unnatural mechanical whine just outside his bedroom window. He stepped into the front yard barefoot, jaw clenched, and found a landscaping crew cutting the edge of his already trimmed lawn with gas trimmers that sounded like chainsaws, deliberately angling their machines toward his driveway to spray clippings. Across his path, they wore no uniforms, carried no IDs, and ignored him completely when he asked to dispatch them. One of them pulled out a phone and began recording him silently, holding the camera chest high without comment. Luke didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply turned, walked back inside, and took a photo of the truck license plate through the blinds. He logged the time. He made a note. That same afternoon, a notice appeared on his mailbox. It wasn't official, didn't come from any agency, but looked convincing. Printed on faux legal letterhead, using language that mimicked municipal citations. This property has been scheduled for compliance review under the Health and Environmental Oversight Program. There was no such program. A brief call to the county confirmed it. But the wording was just believable enough to make someone else think twice. That was the point. Not legal action. Psychological destabilization. Luke pulled the notice, scanned it, and added it to his file. He was starting to run out of room in the drawer. 2 days later, someone dumped a dead squirrel on his porch. Cleanly placed, not mangled, no sign of animal damage. Just the body, carefully positioned next to his welcome mat. Legs stiff, fur undisturbed. Not the work of wildlife, not coincidence. A symbol, a message. He buried it without ceremony, checked the cameras, found no new footage, and replaced the batteries in the backup motion sensors. Then, as the sun set, he saw them. 3 silhouettes walking the street just beyond the boundary of his yard. Flashlights angled toward curbs and utility poles, pausing in front of his driveway, whispering. They didn't trespass. They didn't leave anything. But they wanted to be seen. Luke didn't confront them. He didn't engage. He stood in the dark behind his porch screen, motionless, watching. The cart was locked, inert, but his hand rested on the ignition key like an anchor. The next morning, the power went out. It wasn't citywide, it wasn't an outage, it was localized. Only his address was affected. He checked the breaker panel. No tripped switches. He checked the exterior box, padlocked shut with a notice marked, "Internal servicing in progress." No technician on site, no appointment scheduled. When he called the utility company, they told him the disconnect had been requested 2 days prior for safety maintenance. The request came from the management office that oversaw community infrastructure. They were unable to reconnect without a supervisor's release. Luke called the supervisor, the number forwarded to voicemail. He left a message. No one returned it. For the next 36 hours, he ran on backup battery power, cooled his refrigerator with ice blocks, and cooked using the emergency propane unit he'd built into the garage wall, a feature that now, ironically, was all that kept him from food. Spoilage. Still, he didn't explode. He adapted. He documented. But even Luke had limits. When Tank went missing, those limits thinned to a strand. It happened just after dusk. The gate had been latched, the fence unbroken. The cameras were still functional. But somehow, the dog was gone. Luke searched for hours, calling, walking, checking the brush lines around the perimeter of the neighborhood, rewatching the footage for any sign of exit or abduction. There was nothing. The dog was there, and then he wasn't. The next morning, a note appeared in his mailbox. It was handwritten, folded twice, and unsigned. It read, "Sometimes things get lost. It's safer that way." No threat, no accusation, just implication. Luke didn't eat that day. He didn't speak. He didn't leave the property. He sat in the garage, staring at the partially disassembled pump system in the back of the cart, one gloved hand gripping a wrench that he didn't move for hours. When night fell, he took the ignition assembly apart, examined the internals, cleaned the lines, and ran a safety check on the fire system 3 times. The cart wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even a protest vehicle anymore. It was a carrier of line, a statement of division, a final barrier between the illusion of governance and the reality of force. He didn't sleep. The next afternoon, as if on cue, Karen Meeks appeared. She didn't come alone. 2 men in dark collared shirts stood behind her at the edge of the lawn, arms folded, not smiling. Karen herself wore a pale green blazer, slacks that didn't match the shoes, and carried a black binder with no insignia. She didn't walk up the path. She stood by the curb and spoke clearly, loudly, with performative casualness. "We just wanted to check in," she said. "You've made quite a presence lately." Luke didn't respond. She continued. "There are channels for this kind of thing, you know. You could have used the meeting last month. You didn't have to. Well, you know." Luke stepped forward once, not quickly, just far enough that his shadow met the tip of hers. He didn't speak. She glanced sideways at the taller of the 2 men who subtly reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, which he tossed onto the grass in front of Luke's boot. "Legal consultation," he said. "We recommend it." Then they left. No further words. The next morning, Luke found Tank lying in front of the garage door, dirty, limping, dehydrated, but alive. No collar, no tag. A small patch of fur shaved on his hind leg, but otherwise unharmed. No notes, no messages. Just the dog, returned like borrowed property. That night, Luke went into the garage and locked the door from the inside. He spent 7 hours going over every inch of the cart. Structural supports, power routing, regulator calibration, pressure limits. He adjusted the lighting panels for clarity, cleaned the nozzles, tested the trigger relay 3 times. When it was done, he sat behind the wheel, breathing slow and quiet, watching the rows of blinking indicators on the internal panel. Outside, the neighborhood lights blinked off, one by one. No one drove by. No one walked past. It was quiet. He stayed there until sunrise, because they had taken everything else. But the line was still his. The final confrontation didn't begin with a declaration or any loud warning. It began with a formal notice printed on high-gloss paper, slipped into Luke's mailbox without postage, bearing the header, "Property decommission intent, final stage." It wasn't an eviction and didn't come from a court. It was a fabricated document, written in the careful legal mimicry of bureaucratic theater. There was no legal power behind it, no judicial authority, but that didn't matter. Its purpose was psychological. It was designed to look like something real to everyone else, something enforceable, something irreversible. The message wasn't that Luke had lost his rights, it was that no one else would stand for them if someone tried to take them away. That subtle erosion of solidarity was always the final tactic. Not destruction, isolation. Make the man look already gone and no one would miss him when the rest followed. But Luke wasn't gone. He was waiting. The notice was just the spark he needed. The annual executive session of the board, the real power brokers, the ones who didn't appear in the neighborhood app or sign the passive-aggressive holiday mailers, was scheduled for that afternoon. It wasn't public, but he knew the location, and more importantly, he knew the layout. It would be held in the development's small event center, a 1-story concrete and glass building framed by hedges and surveillance cameras, hidden behind ornamental trees meant to give the illusion of privacy. Luke had no intention of interrupting with noise. He was going to enter like a fact. He prepared with precision. The cart had already been brought to full operational readiness. Ethanol chambers filled, backup relay tested, plume dispersal lines primed and flushed. It didn't carry a single offensive element, no weaponry, no physical obstruction systems. But it was armored in truth. Every fixture was certified, every upgrade documented. He carried laminated permits clipped inside the frame. His tools were locked in a steel crate affixed to the rear compartment, bolted down and compliant with transport regulations. He drove at 5 miles per hour, not out of caution, but to ensure visibility. This wasn't a sneak. This was a message written in motion. When he turned onto the drive that led toward the event center, several people on the sidewalk froze. Some turned away. Others raised their phones. A few crossed the street without looking back. It didn't matter. They had already made their choice. The road curved gently, hemmed in by planters and decorative stones, designed to create a sense of intimacy. Luke read it as constraint. He passed through the open gates without being stopped, without resistance, without greeting. No security, no checkpoints. They didn't think they needed one. That was their mistake. The parking area in front of the event center was half full, populated mostly by matching mid-size sedans and imported hybrids. Luke parked just outside the perimeter, alongside a row of ornamental bushes. He didn't idle. He powered down, set the brake, stepped out, and unlatched the rear hatch. From it, he retrieved a single, flat case. Inside were 7 binders, each marked by color-coded tabs, each containing documented reports of coordinated harassment, false citations, non-jurisdictional inspections, and fraudulent committee actions. He carried them in one hand, his other gripping the ignition key still warm from the drive. He walked up the path toward the side entrance. Not the front, which would be guarded by custom, if not security. This door was functional, utility accessible, and never locked during meetings due to fire regulations. He didn't break in. He simply opened it. Inside, the building smelled like printer toner and cheap citrus disinfectant. The fluorescent lights buzzed with that hollow drone that only institutions seem to emit. The board members were seated in a semicircle in the main conference room, backs to the large window that overlooked a stone fountain. The air inside was cool, sanitized, and thick with the kind of controlled discussion used to mask coordinated decisions. Karen Meeks was at the center, arms folded across a floral scarf. She was speaking in that precise rhythm of someone who always assumes their voice will go uninterrupted. But it did. Luke entered without announcement, without hesitation, and placed the binders on the end of the table. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He simply stood, letting the weight of the moment rest not in what he said, but in what he represented. There were 12 people in the room. None of them moved. 2 flinched. One man near the corner began to rise as if to object, but caught himself halfway. Karen didn't flinch. She didn't speak. Her eyes narrowed and her lips pressed into a smile so tight it nearly vanished. "Mr. Danner," she said, her voice syrup-slick and cold, "I don't believe you're on the schedule." He stared at her for one full breath before responding. "You already took me off the schedule," he said, calmly, clearly. "Now I'm putting myself back on." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her fingers gripped the arms of her chair more tightly. "This is a private meeting." "You made me public," he replied. "Every citation, every false claim, every neighbor you turned into a report writer. You made it public. I'm just returning the favor." He stepped back once, just enough to reach the side door, and with practiced precision, clicked the ignition on the cart via remote starter. Through the window, the cart's systems began to hum. Lights flared once, low and even. The ethanol system hissed. 12 columns of fire shot into the air from the cart's chassis, spaced evenly, angled safely upward, dancing in symmetrical rhythm. They didn't scorch. They didn't spread. They burned pure and bright. Visual testimony. Audible message. Controlled rage rendered lawful. Gasps broke the silence. One woman stood and backed away from the window. Another whispered something to a man who had gone pale. Karen rose slowly, her mouth opening, but Luke spoke first. "This isn't a threat. It's a record. A real-time demonstration of what happens when a citizen follows the rules and is punished anyway. I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here for acknowledgement. He pulled from his jacket a small stack of printed witness statements. Neighbors who had since moved away, residents who had been cited into silence, even a few local employees who'd chosen to share, quietly, what they had seen. He placed the stack atop the binders. "You didn't beat me," he said. "You provoked me. And now you're looking at the consequence of what happens when you push someone too far and they push back without breaking." Karen stared at him. For once, she didn't speak. Luke turned toward the window, watching the final plumes arc and die in coordinated silence. He pressed the kill switch. The cart went dark. Without a word, he left. The room stayed quiet for a long time after. There was no explosion in the aftermath, no immediate announcement of policy change or sudden mass resignations. The board didn't collapse. The committee didn't dissolve. Karen Meeks wasn't marched out in disgrace. The development continued to function, on the surface, exactly as it had before. But something had shifted, subtly, irreversibly. Luke knew better than to expect drama. Systems like this didn't crack, they eroded. And erosion, once it begins, never truly stops. Over the following days, the patrol carts drove a little slower. The notes in mailboxes disappeared. The citation boards in the community center were quietly taken down. And, most telling of all, the private compliance sessions, scheduled for certain residents, were postponed indefinitely without explanation. Luke didn't return to the meetings. He didn't join the new committees or file any petitions. He didn't need to. His presence was now permanently accounted for, not through position or title, but through effect. He had become a variable no one could control, but everyone now had to consider. That was enough. Karen Meeks remained in place, but her voice no longer carried the same gravity. At the next public event, her usual platform speech was replaced by a short group statement read by another member. She stood to the side, clapping politely, saying nothing, smiling too broadly as though trying to pretend her silence was strategy. People didn't avoid Luke now, but they didn't greet him either. He became something else, not a neighbor, not a threat, but a landmark. An unspoken boundary around which the entire community subtly reoriented. He still kept to himself, still mowed his own lawn, still worked in the garage without explanation. The cart remained parked inside, clean, quiet, untouched. The ethanol system drained, the nozzles disconnected, but it stayed visible, always half covered by a weatherproof tarp, as if waiting for a reason to breathe again. No one asked about it. No one challenged it. Tank recovered, slowly but fully. He followed Luke more closely now, always just a few steps behind, as though the disappearance had tethered him permanently to the man who never stopped looking. The two walked the perimeter each evening, silent, methodical. Not in paranoia, but in presence. Sometimes Luke noticed lights dimming as they passed, curtains shifting. It didn't matter. People could watch. They always had. Now they did it with caution instead of entitlement. The fake citations stopped arriving. The anonymous notes ceased. Utility service remained uninterrupted. The game, for all intents and purposes, was over. Still, Luke didn't relax. He wasn't waiting for retaliation, but he understood the nature of control. Just because it recoiled didn't mean it surrendered. Power didn't vanish when it was embarrassed. It simply searched for new ways to enforce itself. That's why he kept the binders. That's why he continued to log events, file reports, scan everything. He didn't document to win. He documented to endure. In systems like this, survival wasn't about victory. It was about being too solid to erase. Months passed. New residents moved in. The committee adjusted its tone. Community values became neighborhood feedback. The language softened. But Luke saw through the rebranding. He saw the same old hands behind the curtains, now quieter, more careful, less certain. His neighbors began planting without waiting for permission. One man installed a solar panel setup without submitting diagrams. A family 2 doors down painted their garage door a color not listed in the compliance guide. No fines arrived, no warnings. The rules hadn't changed, but the fear had faded. One example had broken the illusion of inevitability. That was all it took. On a mild evening near the end of spring, Luke stood in his driveway watching the dusk bleed over the rooftops. He held a cup of coffee cooling slowly in his hand. Across the street, a boy tossed a ball against a garage. No one yelled. No one told him to stop. The air smelled like cut grass and iron, familiar, grounding. He glanced at the garage, the tarp barely stirring in the breeze. The cart rested beneath it, silent and unassuming, but still there, still real. It had never needed to burn anything. Just exist. Just prove it could. Luke turned and walked inside. The door closed behind him without sound. He didn't check the cameras. He didn't scan the perimeter. He didn't need to. He had done what he came to do. And the fire, finally, had left the road.